The water came in the dark. That is the detail the survivors keep returning to years later when they try to explain what happened. It did not arrive as a wave. It rose. Quietly, patiently, with a kind of terrible calm, the water climbed the legs of kitchen tables and reached for the family photographs on the wall. And by the time the sun came up over the Kimberley, a piece of Western Australia the size of a small country had simply ceased to exist as dry land. Homes that had stood for generations were islands. Roads that connected entire communities had become rivers. And the cost, when the engineers and the insurers finally finished their grim arithmetic, climbed past $3 billion, making it one of the most expensive natural disasters in the recorded history of the state. But the number is not the story. It is only the shadow the story leaves behind. Because what truly happened in that flood was not just the destruction of property, it was the exposure of something older. When the water finally pulled back, it left the red earth scoured and raw. And in that raw ground, it revealed traces of a human story stretching back not hundreds of years, but tens of thousands. The flood did not just break the present, it uncovered the past. If you find these forgotten chapters of history as quietly fascinating as I do, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and to like this video. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who want to hear them, and it costs you nothing but a single tap. Now let us go back to the water. To understand the scale of what happened, you first have to understand the country itself. Western Australia is enormous. It is a single state that covers roughly a third of an entire continent, a landmass larger than most nations on Earth. And yet across that vastness, there are fewer people than live in a single mid-sized city. The north of the state, the Kimberley and the Pilbara, is a landscape of deep red rock, of ancient gorges carved by rivers that have been flowing for longer than the human mind can comfortably hold. For most of the year, this country is dry. It is a place of heat and dust and enormous silence, where the rivers shrink to chains of still green pools and the ground cracks open under a sun that feels close enough to touch. People who do not know the North imagine it as a desert, empty and unchanging. But the people who live there know that the North has a season that arrives like a held breath finally released. They call it the wet. The wet season in Northern Australia is one of the great dramatic events of the natural world, and it is governed by the monsoon and by the storms the monsoon can build. Through the long, dry months, the land bakes, the air grows heavy, and then, somewhere out over the warm waters to the north, the atmosphere begins to organize itself into something with intent. Tropical lows form. Some of them deepen into cyclones. And when one of those systems crosses the coast and stalls over the land, it can release an amount of water that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen it. We are not talking about a heavy afternoon shower. We are talking about rainfall measured not in millimeters but in meters, falling over catchments the size of small European countries. All of it draining towards the same ancient river systems at the same time. The river at the heart of this story is the Fitzroy. To look at it in the dry season, you might not understand why anyone would fear it. It moves slowly between its banks, brown and gentle, lined with paperbark trees and the deep shade that travelers learn to love. Children swim in it. Families fish along its edges. But the Fitzroy has a second identity, and the people of the Kimberley have always known it. When the great rains come, it transforms. It becomes one of the most powerful rivers on the entire continent, draining a catchment so vast that water falling hundreds of kilometers apart all arrives in the same channel within days. In full flood, the Fitzroy can carry a volume of water that rivals the largest rivers on Earth, and it can spread across the surrounding plains until it forms an inland sea visible from space. For the Aboriginal peoples of the region, this was never a surprise. The traditional owners of this country, communities whose connection to these floodplains reaches back through an almost unimaginable depth of time, have always understood the river as a living thing with a temper. Their knowledge of the land encoded the flood. Their stories carried warnings about which ground was safe and which ground belonged to the water. This was not folklore in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. It was a sophisticated, tested, multi-generational understanding of how a dangerous landscape behaved, refined over a span of time. that makes the entire written history of Europe look brief. And this is where the deeper layer of the story begins to surface, because the human presence along the Fitzroy and across the Kimberley is not a recent thing. It is ancient, almost beyond comprehension. Archaeologists working in this part of Australia have uncovered evidence that people have lived in this landscape for tens of thousands of years. The deep rock shelters of the region preserve a record of human occupation that stretches back through ice ages, through dramatic shifts in climate, through periods when the coastline lay far out beyond where it lies today. The people who walked this country watched the world itself change shape around them, and they remembered, and they passed that memory forward. So when a catastrophic flood tears through the Kimberley in the present day, it is moving across one of the longest continuously inhabited regions on the planet. Every gorge, every river bend, every red ridge has been known and named and held in human memory for a length of time that genuinely strains belief. And that is why a flood here is never only a disaster of the present. It is also an event that disturbs the deep archive of the land. When the floodwaters carve into a riverbank, they can slice open layers of earth that have not seen daylight for thousands of years, exposing old campsites, ancient hearths, the patient evidence of lives lived along these same waters in a time before recorded history began anywhere on Earth. Now let us return to the flood itself. It did not announce itself as a monster. It began, as these things so often do, with a name on a weather map. A tropical system formed in the warm waters off the northern coast, and at first it looked like one of the many tropical lows that drift through the region every wet season without doing serious harm. But this system did something that turned an ordinary threat into a historic one. It moved inland, and then it slowed down, and then it very nearly stopped. A cyclone that moves quickly across the land is dangerous, but its danger is limited by time. It passes, the rain it brings, however heavy, falls, and then ends. But a system that stalls is a different kind of enemy entirely. When a rain-bearing system parks itself over a catchment and refuses to move, it does not deliver a single blow. It delivers a siege. Hour after hour, it pulls moisture up from the warm ocean and releases it over the same stretch of country, and the ground beneath simply runs out of any capacity to absorb what is falling. The soil saturates, the smaller creeks fill and overflow, and then all of that water, with nowhere left to go, begins its long gathering journey towards the great river that drains the entire region. That is what happened across the Kimberley. The rain did not fall for an afternoon. It fell relentlessly across an area so large that the human mind struggles to picture it, and all of that water began converging on the Fitzroy at once. The river rose past every level that anyone living had ever witnessed. It climbed past the markers left by previous floods. It climbed past the heights the oldest residents could remember being told about by their own grandparents. It rose into genuinely uncharted territory, into a flood that the official records would later describe as the worst the region had ever seen. The water spread far beyond the river channel, pushing out across the floodplains until the landscape itself seemed to change its fundamental nature. Where there had been red plains and scattered communities and long straight roads, there was now a vast brown sheet of moving water, dotted with the tops of trees and the roofs of buildings. From the air, in the photographs that would later travel around the world, it did not look like a flooded river at all. It looked like an ocean that had decided to occupy the land. Towns became islands. Communities that had always been connected by road found themselves completely cut off, reachable only by aircraft, surrounded on every side by water that stretched to the horizon. For the people living through it, the experience was both terrifying and strangely slow. This is one of the things that makes a great river flood so different from the sudden disasters we often imagine. There was no single moment of impact. Instead, there were hours and then days of watching the water come. People stood on their verandas and watched the river edge across their yards. They moved their belongings to higher shelves, and then to the roof, and then they understood that there was nothing higher left to move things to. They watched the floodwater rise through the rooms where they had raised children, and they had to make the hard and humbling decision to leave it all behind and climb into a helicopter or a boat with nothing but the people they loved. The evacuation effort that followed was enormous. Aircraft flew in and out of cut-off communities, lifting families to safety, carrying them away from homes they did not know if they would ever live in again. Emergency crews worked in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, navigating water that hid every obstacle beneath its brown surface. And through it all, the rain kept falling and the river kept rising. When the water finally crested, it had rewritten the record books. The flood was officially recognized as the most significant flood event in the recorded history of that river system. A vital bridge, a crossing that served as a lifeline connecting communities and carrying the traffic of the entire region, was severely damaged by the sheer force of the water, severing a critical link and isolating people for far longer than the flood itself lasted. Roads were not simply covered, they were destroyed. Homes were gutted. Power, communications, clean water, the supply of food, all of it was disrupted at once across a region larger than many countries. And then came the accounting. As the water slowly withdrew and the scale of the destruction became visible, the engineers and the governments and the insurers began the difficult work of putting a figure to the loss. The number they arrived at was staggering. The damage climbed past $3 billion, but as we said at the beginning, the number is only the shadow. To understand the true weight of this event, you have to look at what the water left behind when it finally went home. When a flood of this magnitude recedes, it does not simply leave wet ground behind. It leaves a transformed world. The floodwater, in its passage across the land, acts as an immense and indiscriminate force of erosion. It carves new channels. It strips topsoil from some places and dumps thick layers of silt across others. It rearranges riverbanks that had held their shape for centuries. And in doing so, it performs a kind of accidental and violent archaeology. This is the part of the story that connects the disaster of the present to the deep human history of this land. The Kimberley is one of the most ancient inhabited landscapes on Earth. Beneath its red surface, layered in its riverbanks, and its sand dunes, and its rock shelters, lies a physical record of human life that goes back tens of thousands of years. Normally, that record is sealed, protected by the slow and gentle accumulation of time, hidden under layers of undisturbed earth. But a catastrophic flood breaks that seal. When the Fitzroy, in full fury, cuts a fresh face into a riverbank, it can slice straight through those buried layers, exposing in a single violent week what would otherwise have remained hidden for another 1,000 years. Across northern Australia, major floods have a documented history of doing exactly this. As banks are scoured and dunes are cut open, the floodwaters reveal the buried evidence of ancient occupation. Old hearths emerge, the charcoal of fires lit by people who lived here in a time before the pyramids of Egypt were even imagined. Stone tools, shaped and used and discarded by human hands, are washed out of the earth. Shell middens, the great accumulated remains of countless ancient meals, are sliced open and exposed. And in the most significant cases, the floodwaters have been known to disturb ancient burial grounds, bringing the remains of the old people, the ancestors, up towards the light. For the traditional owners of this country, these revelations carry a weight that has nothing to do with academic curiosity. When a flood exposes the resting place of an ancestor, it is not a discovery in the cold sense of that word. It is a profound and serious event, a disturbance of something sacred, a responsibility that falls upon the living to care for the old people correctly. The flood, in this sense, collapses the distance between the deep past and the present moment. It takes a community that is already grieving the loss of homes and infrastructure and forces them, at the very same time, to confront the physical presence of their own ancient history, suddenly and unexpectedly laid bare by the water. This brings us to the question of ancestry itself, and to one of the most remarkable scientific stories on the entire planet. The flood exposed the physical traces of the past, but the people of this region carry a different kind of record, an invisible one, written not in the riverbanks, but in their own bodies. They carry it in their DNA. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia represent one of the oldest continuous human populations on Earth. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a conclusion supported by a growing body of genetic research. When scientists have studied the deep ancestry of Aboriginal Australian communities, they have found a genetic story of astonishing depth and continuity. The evidence indicates that the ancestors of today's Aboriginal peoples were among the earliest modern humans to leave the African continent, part of the great dispersal of our species across the world. They traveled along the southern coast of Asia until they reached the ancient continent geographers call Sahul, the single great landmass that once joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into one. And then, having arrived, they stayed. The genetic record suggests a remarkable degree of continuity in this part of the world, a population that put down roots in this land tens of thousands of years ago and remained generation after generation through every change the climate could throw at them. They were here through the height of the last ice age. They were here when the great ice sheets melted and the seas rose and drowned the land bridges, cutting Tasmania and New Guinea away and giving Australia the shape we know today. The people of the Kimberley, the communities whose homes were inundated by this very flood, are the living descendants of that ancient and unbroken line. The same families standing on their rooftops watching the brown water rise carry, in every cell of their bodies, a genetic inheritance that connects them directly to the first human beings ever to set eyes on this continent. When you hold those two facts together, the meaning of the flood deepens considerably. The water did not just damage property worth $3 billion. It swept through the homeland of a people whose ancestry in that exact landscape stretches back further than almost any other human story anywhere on Earth. The DNA of the Kimberley is, in a very real sense, a map of human history itself, and the flood, by disturbing the ground and the ancient sites within it, briefly and violently pulled that long history up into the light of the present day. There is a particular detail in this genetic story worth pausing on because it speaks directly to the relationship between these people and the floods themselves. The communities of Northern Australia carry, in their oral traditions, an extraordinary memory of a changing world. They have stories that describe a time when the coastline lay much further out to sea, when places that are now beneath the ocean were once dry land, where people walked and hunted and lived. For a long time, outsiders treated these stories as simple myth, but the science of the rising seas tells a different tale. At the end of the last ice age, as the great ice sheets melted, the sea level around Australia rose dramatically, drowning vast areas of what had been coastal plain. And the timing of that flooding lines up, in case after case, with the geography described in the oral traditions. These communities appear to have preserved, through an unbroken chain of storytelling stretching across hundreds of generations, an accurate memory of real geographical events that happened thousands of years ago. It means that the people of this region are not only genetically ancient, they are the keepers of a living archive, a record of how the land and the water have wrestled with each other since the deep past. So when these same communities speak about the rivers, about which ground floods and which ground is safe, they are not guessing. They are drawing on a body of knowledge refined across a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of modern science. They knew the Fitzroy would rise. They knew the floodplains belonged, in the end, to the water. The tragedy of the modern flood is not that the danger was unknown. It is that so much had been built over the past 2 centuries in places that the deep knowledge of the land had always understood to be the river's own country. This is part of why the disaster carried such a complicated weight. It was, on one level, a story of failed infrastructure and enormous financial loss, told in the language of insurance and engineering and government recovery funding. But on another level, it was a much older story playing out yet again. It was the river doing what the river has always done, what the ancient stories always said it would do, moving across the low country and reclaiming it, however briefly, as its own. The recovery from a flood of this scale is not measured in weeks. It is measured in years. When the water finally drained back into the river channel and the floodplains began to dry, the communities of the Kimberley were left to face a landscape that had been fundamentally altered. Homes that had been submerged were often beyond saving, their structures weakened, their interiors ruined by silt and contamination. Families who had been evacuated returned when they could to find that the places they had left were no longer livable. Some communities faced the prospect of rebuilding almost from nothing. The damaged bridge became a symbol of the whole event. A single broken crossing, severed by the force of the water, meant that an entire region was cut in two. Supplies that normally arrived by road now had to be flown in or barged in at enormous expense. The simple act of traveling from one town to another, something that had been a routine drive, became a long and difficult journey. The repair of that one piece of infrastructure was a major engineering effort in its own right, and until it was complete, the daily life of thousands of people remained disrupted. But alongside the engineering and the rebuilding, there was another kind of recovery taking place, a quieter one. The flood had disturbed ancient sites. It had exposed the traces of the deep past and, in some cases, the resting places of the old people. And so, as the practical recovery moved forward, traditional owners and archaeologists and cultural heritage workers undertook the careful and respectful work of responding to what the water had revealed. Sites were recorded. Exposed remains, where they were found, were treated with the seriousness and the ceremony they deserved. The deep history that the flood had pulled into the light was, as far as possible, returned to its rest. There is something profound in that double recovery, in the way a single community had to rebuild both its present and its relationship with its own ancient past at the same time. It speaks to a resilience that is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. These are people who have lived in this exact landscape for tens of thousands of years, through ice ages and rising seas and countless floods that no written record ever captured. It is worth asking, as we near the end of this story, what the Great Flood of the Kimberley truly means. It is tempting to file it away as simply another natural disaster, a sad but ordinary event in a world that produces such events with grim regularity. But to do that would be to miss the deeper layers that make this flood worth remembering. On the surface, it is a story about water and money, about $3 billion of damage and a broken bridge, and thousands of people lifted from their rooftops by helicopter. That story matters. It matters to every family who lost a home, to every community that had to rebuild. But beneath that story lies another one, and it is the one this video has tried to bring to the surface. It is the story of a land that remembers. The flood, in its violence, became an accidental archaeologist, cutting open the riverbanks and revealing the physical evidence of one of the oldest continuous human stories anywhere on Earth. It reminded everyone who was paying attention that the Kimberley is not a young or an empty landscape. It is one of the most ancient inhabited places on the planet, a homeland held by a people whose genetic roots reach back to the very first human journeys out of Africa and across the world. The DNA carried by the communities of that region is a kind of document, a record of deep time written in living flesh, and the oral traditions they carry are a second document, an archive of memory that has accurately preserved the shape of a changing coastline across thousands of years. The flood disturbed the physical ground, but it also drew attention to these invisible records, these astonishing proofs of human continuity. The people whose homes were inundated are the descendants of the first Australians, and they are still here, still connected to that country, still holding the knowledge that the river will always, in the end, return. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of the great Western Australian flood. The water did not bring something new into the land. It revealed what was always there. It revealed the depth of the human story written into that red country, a story far older than any bridge or road or town, a story the flood could disrupt but could never erase. The damage will be repaired, the bridges will be rebuilt, and the ancient, unbroken line of people who belong to that land will continue, as they have continued through every flood and every ice age for tens of thousands of years. Thank you for spending this time with me and for listening to a story that deserves to be remembered. If it moved you or taught you something you had not known before, consider subscribing so that you do not miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of the deep history that lies quietly beneath the ground wherever you happen to stand.